7 truths about women who walk alone and why God removes everyone from their life. Biblical wisdom. You keep seeing her in places where the crowd is loud, but she is quiet. Not sad, not broken, just composed. She sits with her shoulders relaxed, her eyes steady, the kind of calm that makes people uneasy because it refuses to beg for company. You watch her move through life without the usual entourage, without the noise, without the performance, and the world rushes to label it. Something must be wrong. She must be lonely. She must be struggling. But what if the truth is the opposite, and heaven is simply watching her walk with that rare kind of strength that doesn't need witnesses? 7 truths about women who walk alone. Why God removes everyone from her life. You see her sitting alone and you assume something's wrong. You see her scrolling by herself, walking quietly, not included, not invited. And the world says, poor thing, she must be lonely. But heaven might just be whispering, there goes my warrior. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Because if you've ever been that woman, or if you're becoming her right now, you already know this first truth in your bones. Walking alone is not always a punishment. Sometimes it's a sign that God is separating you on purpose. Not to isolate you forever, but to protect you long enough for you to become who you're supposed to be. People assume solitude means lack, but in the spirit, it often means selection. When God begins to do something rare in a person, He doesn't always announce it with fireworks. Sometimes He starts with subtraction. He starts by quietly loosening hands that were gripping you, fading voices that were shaping your decisions, and dimming friendships that were distracting you from your own calling. And it doesn't feel glamorous at first. It feels confusing. It feels like the room got colder and nobody told you why. It feels like the invitations slow down. The messages take longer to come back. The "we should hang out" turns into silence. And you start wondering if you did something wrong. But here is where maturity begins to whisper back to you. Not everyone disappears because you failed. Some disappear because access to you is changing. Some doors close because your spirit is shifting, and what used to fit can't fit anymore. This is the first truth about a woman who walks alone. She is not being abandoned the way people think. She is being trained. God is building an inner structure inside you that can hold weight without collapsing. Because there is a level of influence that will crush you if you still need constant validation. There is a level of calling that will confuse you if you still need a committee to approve your choices. There is a level of love that will break you if you still can't stand on your own 2 feet when someone disappoints you. So God begins to teach you something precious. He teaches you how to be steady even when the room is empty. A woman who walks alone is often a woman who has stopped negotiating her worth. She's not chasing people who treat her like an option. She's not laughing too hard to keep a seat at a table that starves her. She's not shrinking her standards so someone else can feel tall. And that decision changes everything. Because the moment you stop begging for crumbs, you start noticing how many relationships were only surviving because you were willing to accept less. When you get quiet, the truth gets loud. When you stop overgiving, the imbalance becomes obvious. When you stop being the one who holds everything together, you find out who was really committed and who was simply comfortable. And here's what makes this so spiritual. The world sees her aloneness and thinks it's evidence of failure. Heaven sees her aloneness and recognizes it as proof of discipline. Because it takes discipline to walk away from places that constantly drain you. It takes courage to be misunderstood and still not go back. It takes faith to keep moving forward when nobody claps for you. And faith is often forged in private, not in public. So when you look at your life and it feels like people are being removed, don't rush to fill the emptiness with whoever is available. Don't panic and assume God forgot you. Don't start chasing the same kind of connections that God is trying to cleanse out of your orbit. Instead, breathe. Let the quiet reveal what you couldn't hear when life was crowded. Let your heart settle long enough to realize something. The loneliness you feared might actually be the space where your strength is being born. This is why the first truth is so important. A woman who walks alone is often the kind of woman God is preparing for a different kind of companionship. Not the kind that uses her, not the kind that competes with her, not the kind that loves the version of her that is easy to control. God is preparing you for connections that honor your soul, not just your usefulness. But before those connections arrive, you need to become the kind of woman who won't abandon herself just to keep someone else. And that is why you look so calm even when the world thinks you should be falling apart. Because deep down you are starting to sense that this season isn't random. It's refinement, it's holy, it's intentional. God is teaching you how to sit at a table with just Him and not feel like you're missing something. He is teaching you how to walk through life with your head up, not because you're proud, but because you finally understand who you belong to. So if you've been feeling the shift, if you've been watching people fade, if you've been wondering why your circle keeps shrinking, hold this close. You are not being left behind. You are being led forward. And the world may keep calling it loneliness, but heaven is calling it alignment. The second truth usually arrives dressed like disappointment. Not the dramatic kind that makes a scene, but the quiet kind that changes your appetite for people. It comes when someone you trusted reveals a side of themselves you cannot unsee. It comes when you realize a friendship only felt safe because you kept lowering the truth. It comes when you notice how your kindness has been used as a currency, how your patience has been treated like permission, how your loyalty has been mistaken for weakness. And in that moment, you finally understand something that hurts and heals. At the same time, sometimes betrayal is not the end of you, it is God purifying your life. Because God does not just remove people randomly. He removes what contaminates your discernment. He removes what keeps you confused. He removes what keeps you attached to cycles that look familiar but produce the same emptiness every time. You might call it loss, but in the spirit it is pruning, and pruning always feels violent to what is attached. It feels like being cut away from what you thought you needed. It feels like being separated from what you invested in. But pruning is not punishment. Pruning is protection with purpose. If you've been through heartbreak, you know how it tries to rewrite your identity. It tries to convince you that you are too much, too intense, too sensitive, too serious. But the truth is, you were simply too real for spaces built on pretending. And when God begins to elevate you, He cannot leave you surrounded by people who benefit from your smallness. He cannot leave you tied to hands that keep pulling you back into old versions of yourself. So He uses exposure. He lets certain things be revealed, not because He enjoys your pain, but because He loves your future. This is why betrayal can become a strange kind of mercy. It shows you who is safe without requiring years of guessing. It unmasks motives you would have excused forever. It forces you to stop romanticizing people who were never truly aligned with you. And yes, it stings because you're not cold-hearted. You don't enjoy losing connection. You don't enjoy ending chapters, but God is teaching you to stop confusing attachment with assignment. Just because someone was close to you does not mean they were called to stay. And here is where your discernment begins to mature. You stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop chasing closure from someone who refuses accountability. You stop trying to heal a bond that was built on you doing all the emotional labor. You begin to notice patterns, who only calls when they need something, who disappears when you need support, who praises you publicly but competes with you privately. The truth doesn't make you bitter, it makes you clear. This is the purification. It's not just about removing bad people, it's about removing bad access. Because not everyone who smiles at you is safe to be near you. Not everyone who compliments you is called to cover you. Some people clap for you, while quietly hoping you never surpass them. Some people love your light, as long as it doesn't expose their darkness. And God in His wisdom will not let you keep feeding relationships that drain your spirit while starving your purpose. So when you look around and realize your circle has thinned, don't interpret that as failure. Interpret it as filtration. God is filtering your life so that what remains is real. And yes, the process can feel lonely because you are watching familiar faces disappear. But there is another side to this truth. When God removes certain people, He also removes certain pressures. The pressure to perform, the pressure to overgive, the pressure to stay silent, to keep peace, the pressure to tolerate what your spirit has outgrown. The woman who walks alone learns to let endings be holy. She learns that not every goodbye is a tragedy. Some goodbyes are deliverance. Some endings are the answer to prayers you forgot you prayed. And as your heart heals, you begin to realize why God allowed the exposure. He was saving you from future sabotage. He was saving you from wasting years on people who only loved the version of you that was easy to manage. So if you've been betrayed, if you've been disappointed, if you've had to walk away with tears in your eyes and peace in your chest, hold this truth gently. God is not destroying your life. He is purifying it. He is removing what cannot go where you are going, and what feels like loss right now is often the beginning of your freedom. The third truth is the one people rarely say out loud because it sounds too bold until you've lived it. A woman who walks alone becomes hard to manipulate. And the moment you become unmanipulable, you become disruptive. Not because you're trying to be difficult, but because you stop responding to the old buttons people used to press. You stop folding under guilt. You stop rushing to fix what you didn't break. You stop apologizing for having boundaries, and to certain personalities that feels like rebellion, even when it's simply healing. There are people who were never truly drawn to your heart. They were drawn to your flexibility. They liked you when you could be bent, reshaped, pressured, or persuaded. They liked you when you were always available, always agreeable, always understanding, even when it cost you peace. But when God starts removing everyone from your life, He is not just taking people away. He is taking away the version of you that was trained to survive by pleasing. And this is where the spiritual warfare gets subtle. Because manipulation rarely announces itself with an obvious threat. It often arrives wearing concern. It arrives as a disappointed tone. It arrives as, after all I've done for you, you've changed, you think you're better now. You're too sensitive, you're too spiritual, you're too quiet. And the old, you would have rushed to explain, rushed to soften, rushed to prove you're still lovable. But the woman God is forming learns a new language. She learns silence. She learns restraint. She learns to let people feel what they feel without volunteering her nervous system to manage it. This truth is why some people react so strongly to your calm. Your calm becomes a mirror. It shows them their lack of control. It reveals how much they relied on your emotional availability to keep themselves comfortable. When you stop engaging in the back and forth, when you refuse to be pulled into chaos, it can irritate the very people who benefited from your instability. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer participating in their pattern. And this is also why God sometimes removes everyone. Because if He is going to use you as a woman of wisdom, a woman of strength, a woman who carries peace into places that are frantic, He cannot allow you to stay surrounded by voices that constantly distort your perception. You need space to rebuild your inner compass. You need quiet to hear the truth about yourself. You need a season where your decisions are not being influenced by fear of losing people. So you become unbargainable. You stop negotiating your values for temporary acceptance. You stop trading your convictions for short-lived comfort. You stop keeping people close out of nostalgia when the fruit is clearly rotten, and as soon as you do, you notice something: some people don't know what to do with you anymore. They try the same tactics and you don't respond. They try to provoke you and you don't perform. They try to guilt you and you don't fold. And your quiet firmness becomes louder than any argument. This is where the Bible's wisdom becomes very practical. Discernment is not just about knowing what is evil. It's about recognizing what is off, what is misaligned, what is draining, what is disguised. Some relationships aren't overtly abusive, but they are spiritually expensive. They cost you clarity. They cost you confidence. They cost you peace. And God, being a good father, will not let you keep paying that price when He's trying to elevate you. So if you've been noticing that you're less reactive, less easily shaken, less interested in proving yourself, don't let anyone convince you that you're cold. You're not cold. You're healed. You're not arrogant. You're aligned. You're not distant. You're discerning. You are learning how to protect what God is building in you. And that's why the woman who walks alone often intimidates people who live by control. Because she is no longer available for the games. She is no longer hungry for validation. She no longer needs permission to say no. And when you reach that point, you stop being a predictable character in other people's stories. You become a steady force in your own. By now, you've started to notice a pattern that feels almost too precise to be coincidence. Certain doors don't just close, they lock. Certain friendships don't just fade, they fall away like leaves at the exact moment you are about to step into something new. And the fourth truth is this: your separation is not random, it's sacred. God sets you apart when what you carry is not meant to be handled casually. In Scripture, God often prepares people in hidden places before He places them in visible ones. Not because He's withholding, but because He's shielding. There are seasons when being surrounded by everyone would actually be dangerous for you, because the wrong voices can distort a calling, and the wrong company can seduce a destiny into compromise. So God, in His wisdom, uses distance. He pulls you away from noise. He removes the constant social pressure. He quiets the room so your spirit can finally stand still long enough to be strengthened. And you might not like how it feels, because being set apart can feel like being left out. It can feel like being overlooked. It can feel like you're standing outside the window watching life happen for everyone else. But God's separation is not rejection, it's consecration. It's God saying you're not common, so your process cannot be casual. When you are called to carry peace, God will train you in places where peace is the only option. When you are called to carry wisdom, God will allow you to be misunderstood until you stop depending on human approval. When you are called to carry spiritual weight, God will strip away distractions until you can hold that weight without collapsing. This is why the woman who walks alone often has a different kind of glow. Not the kind that comes from attention, but the kind that comes from depth. She has been through the internal work most people avoid. She has faced herself without an audience. She has sat with God in the quiet long enough to let truth rearrange her. And that kind of formation is not built in crowds. It's built in solitude, in surrender, in those long stretches where you can't hide behind being busy. So God removes people not because He wants you isolated forever, but because He wants you protected while your assignment matures. Because some people don't just want to be near you, they want to access what's on you. They want your insight without your integrity. They want your warmth without honoring your boundaries. They want your prayers without respecting your purpose. And God will not let your life become a public well for people who refuse to be accountable. This is also why your standards start changing. You become less impressed by charisma and more drawn to character. You become less interested in people who speak loudly about faith but live quietly in compromise. You become more careful with what you share, with who you trust, with who gets to sit close to you. And some people will call that guarded, but God calls it wise. Because when you have been set apart, you learn the difference between connection and covenant. You learn the difference between someone who enjoys you and someone who honors you. You learn the difference between being liked and being covered. And here's the part that brings it home. If God is removing everyone, it may be because you are stepping into a role where distractions would become sabotage. It may be because you are being positioned for a new level of influence, and God refuses to let your heart be entangled with people who would pull you off course. It may be because your next season requires clarity, and clarity cannot survive in constant emotional noise. So don't rush the process by forcing connections that don't fit. Don't treat sacred separation like a social emergency. Let God do the setting apart. Let Him clean out the space. Let Him protect the oil on your life. Because the people who are meant to walk with you in your next season will not need you to shrink to keep them. They will not require you to compromise to stay close. will recognize your value, respect your boundaries, and align with your calling. And that's why this truth matters. When God sets you apart, it is not to punish you, it is to prepare you for a life that cannot be built with weak foundations. Your solitude is not empty, it is holy ground. After the pruning, after the separation, something strange begins to happen inside you. You start hearing again, not with your ears, but with your spirit. And that's the fifth truth. The silence is doing work in you that noise never could. When your life gets quieter, your discernment gets louder. When your circle shrinks, your clarity expands. When you stop living in constant reaction to everyone else, you finally start responding to God. At first, the quiet can feel uncomfortable because it leaves you alone with your own thoughts. The distractions are gone. The constant messaging, the constant opinions, the constant need to show up and prove yourself. It all fades. And now you're faced with a simple question that can feel heavy. What do you actually believe? What do you actually want? What is God actually saying to you when nobody else is talking? This is where many people run back to the crowd. They call old friends. They re-enter old relationships. They scroll longer, stay busier, fill their calendar with anything that keeps them from sitting with themselves. But you are learning to stay. You're learning to sit in the quiet long enough for the fog to lift. Because God doesn't compete with noise. He leads with peace. He speaks with a kind of gentleness that requires your attention, not your anxiety. And the more you practice stillness, the more you realize how much of your past decision-making was influenced by pressure. Pressure to be liked, pressure to be chosen, pressure to be included, pressure to keep everyone happy. But now you're becoming the kind of woman who can pause. You can wait before responding. You can pray before committing. You can observe before trusting. That is not hesitation, that is wisdom. This is also why your decisions start becoming cleaner. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop signing up for things you don't have the grace for. You stop saying yes with your mouth while your spirit screams, no. And people will notice the change. Some will admire it, others will resist it. Because when your boundaries become quiet and consistent, you stop being easily influenced. You stop being emotionally available to everyone. You stop being the person who can be pulled into every conversation, every crisis, every drama. You learn to conserve your energy for what God actually assigned to you. And in that quiet, God starts rebuilding your inner life. You begin to recognize patterns you ignored before. You see how certain people always left you drained. You see how certain environments always triggered insecurity. You see how certain habits kept you spiritually dull. And instead of condemning you, God gives you strategy. He doesn't just expose problems, He reveals pathways. He begins to show you how to live with peace as your baseline, not as your reward after chaos. This is the hidden gift of walking alone. You start becoming emotionally self-governed. You're no longer tossed around by everyone's mood. You're no longer shaped by the latest opinion. Your spirit becomes anchored. And when you are anchored, you become dangerous in the best way because you can't be easily shaken. You don't panic when people leave. You don't collapse when plans change. You don't chase what runs from you. You let God lead, and that leadership shows up in your choices. So if you've been in a season where your life feels quieter than it used to, don't assume you're missing out. You might be tuning in. You might be learning the difference between God's voice and your own fears. You might be developing the kind of spiritual hearing that can detect misalignment quickly before it becomes a full-blown disaster. Because once you can hear clearly, you don't need to argue as much. You don't need to defend yourself as much. You don't need to prove what you know God already confirmed. You move differently. You walk with a calmer pace. You speak less, but your words carry more weight. Your yes becomes dependable. Your no becomes final. And your peace becomes a quiet testimony that something real is happening in you. That is the fifth truth. The silence is not empty. It is training your hearing. And the woman who learns to hear God in the quiet will never again be lost in the crowd. Once your hearing sharpens, you start noticing something else. People will still talk. They will will still assume. They will still create stories about you that feel nothing like your real life. And that's the sixth truth. The woman who walks alone is often misjudged, but she becomes unshaken anyway. Because when God is the one shaping you, you stop needing the world to understand you in order to obey. At first, being misunderstood can feel like a bruise you can't cover. People interpret your quiet as arrogance, your boundaries as attitude, your distance as bitterness, your discernment as judgment. They will say you think you're better when really you've just stopped abandoning yourself. They will say you're cold when really you're calm. They will say you're lonely when really you're guarded because you've learned the cost of giving your heart to people who don't handle it with care. And here's what makes this so difficult. You're not trying to be misunderstood. You're not walking around hoping to be mysterious. You're simply living differently now. You're not available for constant drama. You don't overshare your plans. You don't need to announce every move for applause. You're more private, more prayerful, more intentional. And to people who rely on access privacy feels like rejection. To people who rely on control boundaries feel like disrespect. So you face a choice. You can return to the old version of yourself just to be liked again, or you can remain steady and let time tell the truth. And this is where spiritual maturity shows its face. The woman God is forming learns to stop defending herself from every rumor. She learns that not every misunderstanding deserves a response. She learns that chasing public approval is a trap because the crowd can love you today and misunderstand you tomorrow. But God's opinion remains steady. This is also where you learn the difference between reputation and fruit. Reputation is what people say when you're not in the room. Fruit is what your life produces over time. And fruit doesn't need to argue. Fruit doesn't need to shout. Fruit simply appears. Peace appears. Wisdom appears. Stability appears. Clean decisions appear. And eventually, even the people who doubted you start to realize that your change wasn't a phase. It wasn't a mood. It was a transformation. So when people label you wrongly, you don't panic. You don't scramble. You don't start performing goodness to prove them wrong. You stay consistent because consistency is a language. It speaks over time. It outlasts gossip. It outlives opinions. And in that consistency, you begin to experience something powerful. You start living for God's approval instead of people's comfort. That shift is not small. It is one of the biggest freedoms you can experience as a woman of faith. Because once you stop chasing understanding from everyone, you stop being controlled by everyone. You stop offering your peace as a bargaining chip. You stop shrinking yourself to keep others comfortable. You let them have their opinions while you keep your calling. And yes, sometimes it will feel lonely in a different way. Not because you're alone, but because you're ahead. Ahead in maturity. Ahead in discernment. Ahead in emotional health. And people often resist what exposes what they haven't healed. Your presence becomes a quiet standard. Your choices become a mirror. And not everyone will celebrate that. But you don't need them to, because the truth is when God removes everyone, He also removes your dependence on being understood. He teaches you how to be led, not liked. He teaches you how to be steady, not popular. He teaches you how to walk in obedience even when the room claps for someone else. So if you've been misjudged, breathe. Let it be. You don't have to correct every narrative. Your life will speak. Your fruit will speak. Your peace will speak. And in time, the people who matter will recognize the difference between a lonely woman and a set-apart woman, between someone who was rejected and someone who was refined. That is the sixth truth. You may be misunderstood, but you are not undone. You are unshaken because your foundation is deeper than people's opinions. As the misunderstandings fade into background noise, another shift becomes undeniable. Your priorities start changing from the inside out, like a compass slowly correcting itself after years of being bumped off course. And that's the seventh truth. You begin to choose fruit over friends, depth over noise, and purpose over popularity, even when nobody is watching. There was a time when being included felt like safety, when your phone lighting up felt like proof you mattered, when having a full schedule felt like you were doing life right. But walking alone teaches you something the crowd can't teach. It teaches you that constant connection is not the same as covenant. Being surrounded is not the same as being supported, and attention is not the same as love. So God starts rewiring what you chase. You become less impressed by who knows your name and more interested in who knows your heart. You become less hungry for being seen and more committed to being solid. And that shift often comes with an ache because you're letting go of an old kind of comfort. You're letting go of the illusion that staying busy and surrounded means you're safe. You're letting go of the idea that being liked by everyone is a sign you're living in truth. This is where fruit becomes your filter. Fruit looks like peace that doesn't collapse when people leave. Fruit looks like integrity when nobody is clapping. Fruit looks like self-control when you could easily react. Fruit looks like patience that doesn't turn into self-betrayal. Fruit looks like discernment that can say, "This feels off," and walk away without needing 10 people to confirm it. And you start realizing something that changes everything. God is not impressed by your popularity. He is invested in your formation, so your circle changes not because you hate people, but because you honor growth. You stop feeding relationships that keep you shallow. You stop laughing at things that grieve your spirit just to fit in. You stop spending hours in conversations that go nowhere, that leave you empty, that keep you stuck in the same emotional loops. You start craving what is nourishing. You crave wisdom. You crave truth. You crave quiet moments with God that actually strengthen you. And that craving becomes a boundary all by itself. This is also why some friendships don't survive your elevation, because not everyone is willing to grow with you. Some people want you to stay in the version of yourself that makes them feel safe. They want the you who over-explained, the you who was always available, the you who didn't challenge anything, the you who stayed small so nobody felt threatened. But you are becoming the kind of woman who values calling over comfort. And that kind of woman will naturally outgrow certain rooms. Now, this doesn't make you superior. It makes you sober. It makes you awake. You start seeing how much time you used to spend trying to maintain connection with people who weren't even maintaining themselves. You start seeing how you carried entire relationships on your back. You start seeing how you were pouring into cups that had holes in them and calling it love. And God gently teaches you a new standard. Love without wisdom becomes exhaustion, so you become intentional. You don't just let people into your life because they are familiar. You ask, even quietly, does this connection bear good fruit? Does it bring me closer to God? Or pull me into confusion? Does it help me become more whole or more scattered? And when the answer is clear, you honor it. You stop forcing what doesn't fit. You stop watering what God has already called you to release. And the beautiful part is your life starts producing in ways it never did before. Not because you became harsh, but because you became focused. You have more energy, more clarity, more peace. Your prayers become less frantic and more confident. Your choices become less emotional and more aligned. You begin to show up for your own life with consistency, and that consistency becomes a testimony. People might not understand your solitude, but they will notice your stability. They will notice your glow isn't coming from attention, it's coming from alignment. So if your circle feels smaller, if you've been choosing depth over noise, don't let the enemy convince you that you're missing out. You're maturing. You're developing the kind of fruit that can't be faked. And fruit over time attracts the right people. It draws the right connections. It creates the kind of relationships that don't require you to abandon yourself. That is the seventh truth. You stop chasing crowds because you're learning to produce. And when you produce what is good, what is real, what is lasting, you won't have to beg for meaningful connection. The right people will recognize the fruit and honor the tree. And once you start producing fruit instead of chasing crowds, you begin to understand why your quiet life can feel like a target. Because the eighth truth is this: you become a threat not because you're loud, but because you keep worshiping anyway. You keep choosing God anyway. You keep moving in obedience anyway. And there is a kind of spiritual strength that doesn't look dramatic, but it shakes things in the unseen. The enemy doesn't waste energy on what's already compromised. So if you've felt unusual pressure, unusual doubt, unusual heaviness, especially in seasons where you're doing your best to walk clean and stay aligned, don't automatically assume you're doing something wrong. Sometimes resistance is evidence that something in you is working, not because you're special in an arrogant way, but because you're becoming steady in a world that feeds on instability. A woman who walks alone often becomes dangerous to spiritual darkness because she's no longer dependent on people to stay faithful. Her devotion isn't built on social approval. She doesn't need a crowd to pray. She doesn't need a stage to believe. She doesn't need someone else to validate what God already confirmed. And that kind of faith is hard to derail because it doesn't have many handles to grab. This is why certain attacks come through the mind. If the enemy can't control your environment anymore, he tries to distort your interpretation of it. He whispers, "You're forgotten." He whispers, "You're too much." He whispers, "You're behind." He whispers, "No one will ever understand you." And if you believe those whispers, you'll do the enemy's work for him. You'll run back to unhealthy relationships out of fear. You'll compromise your standards out of loneliness. You'll abandon the quiet place where God has been strengthening you. But you are learning a new kind of warfare. You are learning to answer lies with truth, not with panic. You are learning to sit still and let God stabilize your thoughts. You are learning that feelings are real, but they are not always factual. And you are learning that spiritual pressure doesn't mean spiritual defeat. Sometimes pressure is what happens right before breakthrough because the enemy can sense that you're close to clarity, close to freedom, close to the next step. So you keep worshiping anyway, not as a performance but as a posture. You worship when you don't feel like it. You pray when your emotions are tired. You obey when nobody notices. You keep doing what is right when it would be easier to blend in. That kind of consistency becomes authority. And authority doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes authority looks like a woman who refuses to be pulled into bitterness, refuses to be seduced by shortcuts, refuses to be distracted by the noise. And that refusal frustrates darkness because darkness thrives on reactions. It thrives on chaos. It thrives on emotional spirals and impulsive decisions. But the woman God is forming is learning to move slowly, wisely, prayerfully. She's not easily provoked. She's not easily baited. She doesn't need to win every argument because she's more committed to winning her soul. And that is why you become a threat. You stop being predictable. This is also why God sometimes keeps you hidden, because not every battle is meant to be fought in public. Some victories are forged in private, where God teaches you to hold peace under pressure. He teaches you to resist temptation without applause. He teaches you to stay faithful when nobody is rewarding you for it. And when you learn that your life becomes a light, not the kind of light that begs to be seen, but the kind of light that naturally exposes what's false. So if you've felt targeted, don't be afraid. Don't dramatize it, but don't dismiss it either. Just tighten your alignment, return to prayer, return to truth, return to the quiet place that has been keeping you steady. Because the enemy's goal is not just to make you suffer. It's to make you move out of position, to make you abandon the very solitude that God has been using to strengthen you. But you won't, because you're learning the power of worshiping anyway. And that is the eighth truth. Your quiet devotion becomes public authority, and your private faith becomes a weapon the enemy cannot easily disarm. Now the pattern becomes unmistakable. God didn't just remove people to teach you a lesson. He removed people because he was protecting you from misaligned access. And the ninth truth is, the deeper why God removes everyone from your life when certain connections would sabotage what he is building, or when their presence would keep you from stepping into covenant calling and peace. Because access is powerful. Who has access to your time shapes your focus. Who has access to your emotions shapes your decisions. Who has access to your ear shapes your perspective. And if you are the kind of woman God is forming into wisdom and strength, you cannot afford casual access. You cannot afford spiritual leakage. You cannot afford people who love proximity more than they love purity. So God starts closing gates not out of cruelty, but out of care. Sometimes he removes people because they are a distraction, not evil, not necessarily malicious, but misaligned. Their presence keeps you talking when you should be building, keeps you entertaining when you should be healing, keeps you explaining when you should be resting, and you'll notice it by the fruit. Every time you engage, you feel scattered, you feel drained, you feel foggy, you feel like you've lost your center. God is not punishing you by removing them. He's restoring your focus. Other times, God removes people because they are a liability. There are relationships that look harmless until you step into a new season, and then their jealousy wakes up. Their insecurity intensifies. Their need for control becomes obvious. They don't want to lose access to the version of you they could influence. And when they sense you becoming freer, they start pulling. They start pressuring, they start criticizing, they start rewriting your story. God sees what you don't always see at first. He sees what they might do to you later if they stay close. So he removes them early. That is protection. And sometimes God removes people because they are not built for covenant. They enjoy convenience, but they resist commitment. They love what you provide, but they don't honor who you are. They want your softness without responsibility. They want your loyalty without reciprocity. And if God is preparing you for real covenant, real partnership, real community, he must first break your attachment to counterfeit connection. Because counterfeit connection feels like love until you demand alignment. The moment you demand respect, accountability, and truth, the counterfeit begins to crumble. This is why the removing can feel severe. Because you didn't just lose a person, you lost a pattern. You lost the familiar loop of chasing, fixing, proving over giving. God is not only cleaning your environment, he is healing your appetite. He is teaching you not to crave what harms you, not to mistake intensity for intimacy, not to mistake attention for affection, not to mistake history for destiny. And here's a hard truth that becomes freeing when you accept it. Some people were not sent to stay, they were allowed to show you what you needed to heal. Their role was not to become your forever. Their role was to expose where you still tolerated too little, where you still overextended, where you still feared being alone. God uses seasons and people to reveal you to you. And once the revelation is complete, the season ends. So when God removes everyone, don't interpret it as him taking life away from you. He's taking theft away from you. He's removing the slow drain. He's blocking the door where your energy kept leaking. He's shutting down access to your spirit so you can rebuild without interference. And then comes the positioning, because after God removes, he reassigns. After he prunes, he prepares. After he empties, he fills. The isolation is not your final destination, it is your alignment station. It is where God recalibrates your discernment, strengthens your backbone, and purifies your desire, so that when the right people arrive, you won't cling out of fear. You will choose out of wisdom. This is why you must resist the urge to chase replacements. Don't fill the gap just to feel normal again. Don't lower your standards just to avoid being alone. Let the space stay holy until God fills it with what is aligned. Because the next connections in your life will require the new you, not the old you. And God is making sure the old patterns don't survive into the new season. That is the 9th truth. God removes everyone because he refuses to let misaligned hands touch what he is preparing. And the protection may feel painful at first, but one day you will look back and realize those removals saved you.